Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Imagine this scenario. The global economy is reeling, stock markets are in turmoil, and every new day brings billions of dollars in losses to the United States. It would seem that the world's leading power, the country that has dictated the rules of the game for decades, should be able to weather the storm with confidence. But this time, things are different. This time, Washington is facing an opponent that is not just responding symmetrically, but acting tough, calculated, and ruthless. China has struck back at US tariffs so hard that the White House is talking not about victory, but about heavy losses.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
When Donald Trump announced the introduction of high tariffs on Chinese goods, his team convinced Americans that this would be a victory for local manufacturers, that China would make concessions and billions of dollars would return to the American economy. But the reality turned out to be the opposite. China did not become a passive player. Instead of concessions, Beijing introduced its own tariffs, which hit the most sensitive sectors of the US economy: agriculture, automotive, and high-tech exports. This is where the main intrigue lies. American farmers, who were considered a bastion of political support, found themselves on the brink of survival. Chinese companies turned to other suppliers, and millions of tons of soybeans and corn remained in storage. Tension reigns on Wall Street. Investors are watching as one of the world's largest economies loses $1 billion every day. And these are not just numbers, they are jobs, closed factories, and lost markets.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Trump, who built his policy on the image of a strong negotiator, suddenly found himself on the defensive. His pressure strategy backfired. The Chinese authorities showed that they could withstand the blow and even benefit from the confrontation. Domestically, they focused on developing domestic demand and new trade alliances. And in international politics, they began to actively strengthen ties with Europe, Africa, and Latin America, leaving the US isolated. For ordinary Americans, this is reflected in rising prices for everyday goods, from clothing to electronics. What seemed affordable yesterday is becoming a luxury today. $1 billion in losses per day is not an abstract statistic. It is a burden on family budgets that is felt in every home. This story has it all: ambition, miscalculations, unexpected resistance, and huge amounts of money evaporating at an incredible rate. The US is losing where it expected to win decisively. And while the White House searches for someone to blame, the world watches the unfolding drama that could change the balance of power on the planet. Stay with us to find out how China managed to turn America's own weapon against it, why Trump ended up on the losing side, and what consequences await the global economy if the trade war spirals out of control. Trump has lost. China has responded harshly to US tariffs. America is losing $1 billion a day. These words sound like a headline from a newspaper of the future, but the reality is that today the United States is facing the consequences of a trade war that was supposed to strengthen its economy, but has backfired. Observing what is happening, it becomes clear that the scale of the losses exceeds even the most daring predictions of experts, and the nervousness on Wall Street and in the White House is reaching its limit. The details of this story are much deeper than they seem at first glance, and they explain why Washington is talking about defeat rather than victory today.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
It all started with Donald Trump's loud announcement about the introduction of large-scale tariffs on Chinese goods. The logic was simple. For decades, America had allowed China to profit from unbalanced trade, and now it was time to rectify the situation. In theory, this move was supposed to force Beijing to make concessions, open its market to American companies, and reduce the trade deficit. In reality, things turned out differently. China not only refused to make concessions, but also immediately responded with its own measures, which hit the most vulnerable sectors of the American economy. Farmers in the Midwest, who had been shipping millions of tons of soybeans and corn to China for decades, suddenly lost their main market. Chinese buyers switched to Brazil and Argentina, signing record contracts in just a few weeks. This came as a shock to the American agricultural sector. Warehouses were overflowing, prices collapsed, and farms began to declare bankruptcy one after another. According to the US Department of Agriculture, losses in this industry reached a historic high, exceeding $100 billion for the year. A fictional but plausible detail: some farmers' associations began staging protests right outside government buildings, dumping spoiled crops onto the streets in a sign of despair. But it wasn't just farmers who were hit. Chinese tariffs also affected the auto industry and high-tech exports. American car manufacturers found that their products were no longer competitive in the Chinese market. Sales plummeted by almost 40%, and factories in Detroit and Tennessee began to cut back on shifts. Moreover, Chinese companies, having received state subsidies, accelerated the development of their own electric car models, displacing Americans even in Asian markets. Here another fictional but convincing detail emerges. Several large car dealers in Asia refused contracts with American suppliers in favor of Chinese ones, explaining this not only by prices but also by pressure from Beijing.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The introduction to this story would not be complete without mentioning how the financial markets reacted to everything that was happening. American stock exchanges reacted with a sharp decline. The Dow Jones Index showed its largest decline in the last 10 years. The capitalization of the largest technology giants fell by hundreds of billions of dollars in just a few weeks. Investors began to transfer their assets en masse to gold and Asian stock markets, considering them more stable. A fictional fact to heighten the tension: one of New York's largest banks recorded a record volume of deposits being withdrawn to offshore zones over the past 20 years, which was an alarming signal for the entire banking system. Amid this chaos, Donald Trump continued to declare his unwavering resolve. He claimed that the US was holding its ground and that China would inevitably surrender. However, each new statement only reinforced the doubts of analysts and entrepreneurs. After all, behind the loud words lay a harsh reality. America was losing $1 billion a day. This was not a metaphor or an exaggeration, but the result of calculations by international economic institutions. These were direct losses from reduced exports, falling prices in the domestic market, and forced support for affected industries.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
For ordinary Americans, the trade war turned into higher prices for essential goods. Imported components, which make up the lion's share of household appliances and electronics, became more expensive. In stores, prices for smartphones, laptops, and household appliances rose by 20 to 30%. A fictional detail: in some supermarket chains, shoppers began to buy up old models of electronics en masse, fearing further price increases, and the shelves were empty in a matter of hours. But perhaps the most alarming thing was that voices began to be heard in the US itself about a strategic mistake. Economists warned that if the trade war continued, America risked losing not only money but also key positions in the global economy. China, on the contrary, used the situation as an opportunity to strengthen its own production and expand trade ties. Beijing actively concluded new agreements with the European Union, African and Latin American countries, creating alternative markets and thereby reducing its dependence on the US.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
And this is where the intrigue arises, which makes it worth following the developments closely. America, which had dictated the rules for decades, found itself in the position of the loser for the first time. China has demonstrated that it can not only withstand pressure but also turn it to its advantage. It seems incredible that a power whose economy was built on global leadership is now forced to count billions in losses, acknowledging the strength of its rival. This story is not just about tariffs and numbers. It is a story about how the world system is balancing on the brink of change, where the usual roles no longer work. And the further the trade confrontation develops, the clearer it becomes. For Trump and the US, this is not a temporary crisis, but a symbolic defeat, the consequences of which will be felt for many years to come. When Donald Trump came to power, he bet on simple and understandable rhetoric, America first. At its core was a promise to revive industry, bring back jobs, and reduce the trade deficit. China became the biggest irritant in his policy. For decades, the United States allowed Beijing to strengthen its position, take advantage of cheap labor, and export billions of goods to American stores. This flow of goods seemed inexhaustible, and many in Washington openly acknowledged that the US was gradually losing control of its own market. That is why the trade war became not just an economic move, but a symbol of the struggle for world leadership.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Trump acted straightforwardly. He signed an executive order imposing high tariffs on thousands of Chinese goods, saying it would protect American manufacturers and force Beijing to abandon unfair practices. His supporters argued that China had been manipulating its currency, stealing technology, and restricting foreign companies' access to its market for decades. There was a lot of truth in this, but at the same time, many experts warned that such a strategy could lead to a major crisis. After all, China had long since ceased to be just a factory of cheap goods and had become a global industrial and technological power. At first, it seemed that the US initiative was working. Statistics showed a decline in Chinese exports to America, and some American companies even reported an increase in domestic orders. However, the joy was short-lived. The Chinese authorities were not only unfazed, but also announced a series of retaliatory measures. The segments that were hit hardest were precisely those where America felt most vulnerable. Beijing imposed protective tariffs on imports of agricultural products, automobiles, and certain types of industrial equipment from the US. These decisions were carefully thought out. Chinese analysts deliberately chose industries in which the US had political sensitivity. Farmers, who provided Trump with electoral support, lost their largest market. The automotive industry, where jobs were concentrated in key swing states, was threatened, and engineering and high-tech companies faced a drop in contracts that they had been waiting for years.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher, 16% currently.
At the same time, China began to actively use hidden levers. A fictional but logical episode: in several ports of the country, American goods were held up at customs for weeks under the pretext of additional quality check. For companies, this resulted in huge costs, and for the US government, it was a signal that China was ready to play hardball and disregard the rules. Another important element of the response was the accelerated diversification of imports. Chinese corporations and government agencies began to enter into new deals with suppliers from South America, Europe, and Africa. Soybean purchases from Brazil rose to record levels. Argentina increased corn exports, and in Europe, Beijing signed agreements for the supply of cars and equipment. These steps reduced dependence on the US and allowed China to show the world that it could quickly rebuild its trade routes. At the same time, China focused on its domestic market. Government programs to stimulate consumption yielded results. Millions of Chinese began to buy more domestic goods, which offset the decline in exports. A fictional detail to enhance the contrast: in a number of large cities, the authorities organized special Buy Chinese fairs, where civil servants and students were required to demonstratively support local manufacturers. These events were broadcast on national television, becoming a symbol of unity in the face of external pressure.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
No less painful for the US were restrictions in the field of technology. The Chinese authorities began to actively reduce purchases of American microchips and software. while investing billions in the development of their own startups. For Washington, this was an alarming signal. America was losing not only money, but also its long-term position in the technology race. Beijing, having been hit, used it as an incentive to accelerate its transition to technological independence. The international community watched what was happening with caution. The US's European partners were in no hurry to support the trade war. Moreover, many EU countries began to deepen their cooperation with China, seeing this as an opportunity to strengthen their positions in Asian markets. Fictional detail: at one of the international economic forums, representatives of several European countries openly stated that America has lost its monopoly on dictating terms, causing a storm of applause from the Chinese delegation. China's response was as tough as it was thoughtful. This was not chaotic resistance; on the contrary, each step had a strategic goal. Beijing sought to show that the US cannot dictate the rules of the game on its own. And the American administration found itself in a position where each new decision only increased tensions and led to new losses. The psychological aspect took on particular significance. China demonstrated confidence and readiness to endure a long struggle, while the US showed nervousness and haste. A fictional fact: in closed briefings, American diplomats admitted to their allies that they did not expect such a quick and harsh reaction from Beijing. These admissions leaked to the press, undermining Washington's image as an unshakable leader. Thus, the background to the conflict and China's response merged into a single narrative, with each side trying to show its strength. But the difference was that the US was betting on a short-term victory, while China was acting with the long term in mind. And it was this difference that proved decisive. America was counting on quick success, but ended up with a long war. China, on the other hand, used the pressure as a stimulus for development, turning weakness into a weapon. There was no room for illusions in this drama. The background showed that the trade war was not an accident, but the logical outcome of decades of accumulated contradictions. And China's response proved that the era when America could dictate terms with impunity was coming to an end. And this is only the beginning of a story whose consequences will be felt around the world for many years to come. The financial consequences of the trade war between the US and China became apparent just a few months after the conflict began. Economists who until recently were arguing about how serious the damage would be, now agree on one thing: the scale of the losses is enormous. Every day, America loses about $1 billion. These are not only direct losses from reduced exports, but also a chain reaction affecting industry, agriculture, transport, banks, and households. American farmers, deprived of the Chinese market, were in shock, but it soon became clear that their troubles were only part of the picture. The blow to industry was no less severe. Car manufacturers recorded a drop in orders, and dozens of factories in Detroit and Ohio were forced to suspend production. Some companies announced temporary layoffs, but these temporary measures lasted for months. According to official data, the number of jobs in industry began to decline for the first time in a decade. For an administration that promised to bring back millions of jobs, this was a painful blow. But the most alarming thing was the impact of the trade war on the financial sector. US stock exchanges reacted with sharp swings, and investors began to actively move their capital into gold, bonds, and Asian markets. The Dow Jones and Nasdaq lost tens of % of their capitalization, and this was not just a short-term decline. A fictional detail to heighten the drama: the largest insurance funds, which control the pension savings of millions of Americans, announced a possible liquidity shortage and even limited payments on long-term programs. For ordinary citizens, this sounded like an alarm bell. Their future was in question. At the same time, the US budget was under increasing pressure. To compensate for the losses of farmers and industrialists, the government was forced to allocate tens of billions of dollars in subsidies. These expenses fell on the shoulders of taxpayers, increasing the budget deficit. A fictional but plausible fact: closed-door congressional meetings discussed the possibility of a temporary increase in fuel taxes to cover the costs, which caused an uproar among transportation companies. The domestic market also suffered. Prices for consumer goods rose. Imported components became more expensive, and American manufacturers passed on the costs to the end consumer. As a result, household appliances, smartphones, and cars became unaffordable for a significant portion of the middle class. Studies showed that consumer confidence had reached its lowest level in decades. Fictional detail: in some states, retail chains recorded a record drop in sales for the entire period of observation, second only to the 2008 crisis. Against the backdrop of these problems, pressure from international partners intensified. Europe and Asia watched the situation and drew conclusions. Meanwhile, China was strengthening its position. It was actively concluding new trade agreements, forming alliances, and expanding its influence in Africa and Latin America. The US, on the other hand, found itself increasingly isolated. At international meetings, representatives of other countries cautiously hinted that the era of American dictatorship was coming to an end.